Iran is described as facing water bankruptcy.
Iran is facing its worst water crisis in decades.
Severe water shortages.
Worst water crisis in decades.
Iran is facing the deepest social crisis in its history. The people have taken to the streets for the most basic element of life: water. This is a cry of, "I am thirsty." And although this cry began with peaceful protests, it has turned into an uprising due to the regime's interventions. Now, this humanitarian disaster has reached the gates of Tehran, the capital city of 10 million people. So much so that Iranian President Mesud Pezeşkian, in his historic speech on November 6, 2025, made a confession showing that the state had reached the point of bankruptcy. November 8, 2025. Details of President Pezeşkian's "Evacuate Tehran" and water cut warnings and the ensuing political reactions. And Tehran was preparing for a total evacuation. Pezeşkian said that if there was insufficient rainfall, water cuts would first be implemented in the capital, Tehran. But if that proved insufficient, the option of forced evacuation would be on the table. This was a catastrophic situation, not only for Iran but also for its allies. A water crisis leading to evacuation in a metropolis like Tehran, with a population of 10 million, also meant that electricity could not be supplied. In other words, without water and electricity, life would come to a standstill, and factories would shut down. Moreover, millions of people were out on the streets of the metropolis, hunting for water with buckets. The water crisis and protests actually erupted in 2021. That year, the bloody protests in the streets of Khuzestan and Isfahan were just the beginning of the crisis. It was the cry of the farmers and rural population where the water had run out. However, by the fall of 2025, the crisis had reached the gates of Tehran, the capital city of over 10 million people, the regime's most protected stronghold. The crisis was no longer just a matter of rebellion. It had turned into a scenario of the total collapse of a modern metropolis. Confessions from the top echelons of the state revealed that this humanitarian crisis was not simply a water shortage, but how it had paralyzed the entire systemic infrastructure with a domino effect. The crisis had deepened and reached such an undeniable scale that the regime could no longer conceal the situation with propaganda. On November 6, 2025, President Mesud Pezeşkian, perhaps in a first in the regime's history, publicly admitted the catastrophe facing the capital. According to BBC Monitoring, Pezeşkian stated that the water resources of Tehran, a city of 10 million, were approaching day zero. This term was used for the city of Cape Town in South Africa in 2018 and refers to the apocalyptic day when no water will flow from the taps of a metropolis. Pezeşkian said that all scenarios, including forced evacuation, were on the table to remedy the situation. Details of President Pezeşkian's "Evacuate Tehran" and water cut warnings and the ensuing political reactions. This was much more than a technical warning. It was a state telling 10 million citizens in its own capital, "I may not be able to provide you with water. Be prepared to leave the city." Approximately 10% of Iran's energy production depends on hydroelectric power plants. When the water levels of those massive but dysfunctional dams, which crisscross the country like a web, approached 0 point, the first system collapsed. The hydroelectric power plants stopped. When the hydroelectric power plants went offline, the already fragile national grid failed. Massive power outages began in the capital Tehran, lasting between 2 and 4 hours a day, and up to 12 hours in some areas. These outages did not just turn off the lights, they cut off the internet, they cut off communication, and most importantly, they toppled the next domino. In a modern city, electricity is needed for water to reach your tap. Electricity is needed to run the massive pumps that transport water from treatment plants to homes. When the power went out, the pumps stopped, and Tehran's millions of taps were plunged into weeks of drought. People began carrying water in buckets in the middle of a 21st century metropolis. In fact, Pezeşkian had warned of the coming crisis in August 2025, months before the evacuation confession. Today, we have no water underground or in the dams. The water problem in Tehran, Kerat and Kazvin cannot be solved with tankers. But the most terrifying thing was what would come after the power outage. Without electricity, intensive care units do not work. Dialysis machines stop. Operating rooms go dark. Without water, sterilization is impossible. Reports from hospitals in Tehran show that we are in the midst of a disaster. Intensive care units have closed because they cannot find fuel for generators. Surgeries have been cancelled. Hospitals became unable to fight infection because there was no water. This is not a crisis. This is a social collapse. Factories stopped. Supply chains broke. Food, medicine, everything began to rot in the streets because cold storage facilities were not working. This was an admission by a state that it had abandoned the 10 million residents of its own capital to their fate. And this admission was the final nail in the coffin of the regime's legitimacy. Because this crisis is not just about running out of water. The country itself is literally sinking. According to Iran International's analysis, while per capita water consumption in Tehran is around 250 to 300 litres per day, the emergency quota implemented by Cape Town to avoid its day zero was only 50 litres per person. This highlights how unprepared Tehran is for such crisis management and the seriousness of the situation. As Time magazine points out, this is now seen as the biggest threat facing Iran. It all began in July 2021 in Khuzestan, Iran's oil-rich but most impoverished province. People poured into the streets, standing beside their dead animals in dried-up riverbeds, for one thing only: water. Their slogan was simple, clear, and universal: "I am thirsty." This was not a political demand. It was the most basic human, biological cry. So, what was the regime's response to this human demand? To its own citizens saying, "I am thirsty"? The answer was a brutality that will go down in international human rights reports as a war crime. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch documented in detail what the Iranian security forces did in their emergency reports published in July 2021. According to these reports, security forces used unlawful force, including lethal automatic weapons and birdshot, to disperse peaceful protesters. As a result, at least 9 protesters, including a 17-year-old youth, lost their lives in the streets. But the violence did not end there. November 2021. The location is Isfahan, the cultural heart of Iran. Farmers began a peaceful sit-in on the riverbed of the once majestic Zayandeh River, now a vast dust pit. They had one demand: the return of their water, which had been given away to industrial facilities so they could farm. On the morning of November 26, 2021, security forces attacked the farmers' tents. According to the Iran Human Rights Monitor's report dated December 26, 2021, approximately 40 protesters lost their eyesight and at least 100 people were injured in that intervention. A journalist from Iran Wire spoke with a nurse on duty at the hospital that day. The nurse's testimony revealed the scale of the disaster. By blinding farmers who demanded water, the regime sent a clear message: if you dare to look at the rivers the regime has dried up, you will never see again. The roots of the evacuation panic in Tehran were planted that day, because instead of solving the water problem, the regime chose to eliminate the people who raised the issue. But they couldn't eliminate the problem. The problem is now strangling the regime itself. The damage caused by the regime is no longer just empty taps or dried-up rivers. This damage is now destroying Iran's land itself. This is an irreversible, physical apocalypse. An estimated 70% of the country's groundwater, the inheritance of future generations, has been ruthlessly consumed over the last 30 years. So, what happens when you completely drain the water from beneath the ground? The land collapses like a sponge. Iran is currently one of the fastest sinking countries in the world. In areas like Rafsanjan, the ground is sinking 30 centimeters per year. This is a more terrifying collapse than an earthquake. And now this collapse is hitting the capital, Tehran. Because the massive aquifers, underground water basins, beneath Tehran have been drained, the metropolis of 10 million is literally sinking. Buildings are cracking, roads are splitting, natural gas pipelines are at risk of explosion. All infrastructure is crumbling along with the sinking ground. This is one of the reasons behind Pezeşkian's evacuation confession. The regime is panicking not only because it cannot provide water, but also because it knows the city could soon collapse under its own weight. The second symbol of physical apocalypse is Lake Urmia. It was once the largest salt lake in the Middle East. It was home to millions of people, birds and creatures. But those meaningless dams and corrupt projects built on the rivers flowing into the lake signed the lake's death warrant. Lake Urmia is now officially dead at a rate of 95%. What remains is a vast salt desert that carries toxic salt to the region's agricultural lands and cities with the wind. The regime has permanently destroyed not only the water, but also the country's soil. Do you know what this means? It means that even if water were to return, there would be no soil left for agriculture. It means that mass, forced migration has become inevitable for millions of people. This catastrophe, which has brought Tehran to the brink of zero day, leaving hospitals without electricity and the people without water, did not emerge overnight or solely due to drought. So, how did we get to this point? The answer lies in the regime's darkest secret. This was the bitter outcome of a process that has been going on for decades, fueled by ideology, corruption, and engineering arrogance. Analysts and regime-opposed sources place a structure they call the water mafia at the center of this process. Allegedly, this structure viewed Iran's water resources not as a national treasure, but as a political and economic tool for profit, deliberately drying up the country's lifeblood. The system operates very simply: steal water from the people and farmers and hand it over to water-guzzling industrial facilities loyal to the regime. This mafia has two main weapons. One is concrete, the other is steel. Do you know why the life-giving river Zayandeh in Isfahan dried up? Was it because it didn't rain? No, because the river's water was diverted at its source to the massive Mobarakeh steel factory, which is affiliated with the Revolutionary Guards. This is a steel giant built in the middle of an arid landscape like Iran, and it alone consumes nearly 40% of the total water consumption of the city of Isfahan. This factory was a symbol of the regime's self-sufficient industry propaganda, but in reality, it was a black hole that stole the water, lives, and futures of millions of people. In November 2021, farmers who had lost their eyesight were protesting against the water going to this very factory. The Iranian regime has been experiencing a dam-building frenzy for decades. Over 600 massive dams have been constructed in the country. This has placed Iran third in the world in dam construction. On paper, this may look like a success story, but in reality, it is an engineering fiasco and a monument to corruption. Most of these dams were built without any scientific analysis, completely uncoordinated, to enrich construction companies affiliated with the Revolutionary Guards, such as Khatam al-Anbiya. They disrupted the natural flow of rivers, increased evaporation, and worst of all, stole each other's water. The most tragic example of this fiasco is the Gotvand Dam. This dam was built as one of Iran's largest dams, but there was a small problem. They built the dam on top of a huge salt layer. As a result, the dam's reservoir mixed the Karun River's freshwater with salt and poisoned millions of hectares of agricultural land downstream. Literally, they salted the country's most fertile land. The water mafia stole water with industrial facilities on one hand, while poisoning the rest of the water with useless dams on the other. And the consequences of this organized plunder are now directly affecting the strategic chessboard, that is, Putin's plans. The meaning of this major humanitarian crisis, this internal collapse for the regime, is very clear. Day zero could be the regime's political day zero. According to the World Bank, the likelihood of government change increases by 57% in countries experiencing water scarcity. What is happening in Iran is not simply water scarcity, but a state refusing to provide water to its own people. Experts warn that 50 to 70 million Iranians, or 70% of the population, may be forced to migrate due to this crisis. This is chaos that the regime cannot control or suppress. It is precisely at this point that we turn our eyes from Tehran to Moscow. Vladimir Putin, in the bloody war he started in Ukraine and cannot seem to end, has pinned his hopes on a single ally to survive under Western sanctions: Iran. The cheap, mass-produced Shahed drones Putin needs to strike cities come from Iran. The ballistic missiles he needs come from Iran. Putin needs the Iranian regime's military support to continue the war in Ukraine, just as the Iranian people need water. But now, Putin's strategic calculations are being shaken by that evacuation confession from Tehran on November 7, 2025. Think about it. You are Putin, and your most important ally, the only factory supplying you with ammunition, is discussing how to evacuate its own capital. The regime with which you have signed billions of dollars worth of arms deals is on the verge of being overthrown by its own people, who are rebelling with cries of, "We are thirsty." Your ally, on whom you rely for drones, is literally sinking and cannot protect its own infrastructure due to land subsidence. This is a strategic nightmare for Putin, because the Iranian regime is rapidly becoming a failed state, and failed states are unreliable allies. Failed states cannot deliver weapons. Failed states must focus on internal chaos. Iran's internal collapse threatens to sever one of the logistical arteries of Putin's war machine in Ukraine. Relying on a regime that responds to its people's cries of, "I'm thirsty," with bullets, and to its farmers' pleas for water with shotgun pellets may be one of Putin's biggest strategic mistakes of the 21st century. At this point, only 3 scenarios remain on the table for the Iranian regime, and all 3 could spell the end of the current order. The first scenario is regional evacuations and controlled chaos. This is Pezeşkian's admission. The regime attempts to forcibly evacuate certain areas of Tehran or other major cities where water has completely run out. This means the displacement of millions of people within the country and an uncontrollable social explosion. The second scenario is political concessions in exchange for water. The regime is forced to look to one place for the water technology it needs to survive: the West. This means abandoning its nuclear program and its support for Putin. This is the ideological bankruptcy of the regime. Third scenario: internal collapse and uprisings. The regime does nothing, just as it is doing now. The "I'm thirsty" uprisings turn into a revolution that can no longer be suppressed. This is the physical collapse of the regime. Whichever scenario plays out, one truth remains unchanged. The Iranian regime has evaded sanctions. It has pursued its nuclear program. It has violently suppressed the Mahsa Amini protests. But there is one enemy the regime cannot outmaneuver, suppress, or negotiate with: nature itself. The rivers it has dried up, the lands it has flooded, and a capital city of 10 million left without water are the mullah's worst nightmare. This deep humanitarian crisis in Iran is the most painful example of how water is a matter of national security. And this crisis proves to the whole world how regimes mired in corruption and alienated from their own people can meet their end, including their masters in the Kremlin. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.